Chapter 47. Riders of the Blue Veil, Tuolagi warriors, listen to me! Usal's harsh, grating tones rang out over the market square in the sudden silence that had greeted the pause in combat. As one, Tuolagi, Aridi, and Bedouin all turned to look at him. He was on the eastern side of the square, standing on a market stall to allow him to address them. Holt noted the rough bandage wound round his upper arm. The bandit war leader had made his way clear of the execution platform in the confused moments when Will had begun shooting. Now he had managed to regroup. A force of 20 men stood around him, weapons ready, faces covered by the ubiquitous blue veils. The square was empty now of townspeople, except for those who had been caught up in the battle between the two forces and now lay in crumpled heaps on the stony ground. Perched high on the watchtower, Will heard the Asik's words too. But Usal was hidden from Will's sight by the buildings along the northern side of the square. "Look around you. Look at the enemy. There are barely 40 of them," Usal continued. And he was right. The raiding force had been hard pressed in the battle, and many of them had fallen, never to rise again. The remainder were grouped defiantly in front of the platform where Holt and the others were to have been executed. "We outnumber them. If we work together, we can crush them." There was a sudden growl of assent from the throats of the Tuolagi warriors. They too had lost men in the hard fighting. But they had started with a 4-to-1 superiority, and they had maintained the ratio. As Usal made his point, they began to realize that it was well within their power to crush the small band who opposed them. "Sele then, I give you one chance only. Throw down your weapons and surrender." Selethen laughed harshly. "Surrender? Do you think we believe you'd show us mercy, Usal? You were about to kill us all." Usal spread his hands in front of him. "I'll offer you the mercy of a quick death," he replied. "Otherwise, you'll linger for days in agony. You know my men are masters of slow torture." Selethen looked sideways at Holt. "That's true enough," he said quietly. "I think we'd be better to die with our weapons in our hands." Holt went to reply, then stopped. Somewhere close by, he could hear a faint humming noise, a hum that gradually rose in pitch and intensity. He had no idea what it was. He shook his head, dismissing the strange sound. "I'm with you," he said. "We'll fight on. You never know when something's going to turn up." Usal had waited several minutes for Selethen's reply. When he realized none was forthcoming, he raised his arm above his head, preparing to give the signal to his men for one final, overwhelming attack on the smaller group. "Very well. You've rejected my offer. Now you'll pay. Tuolagi riders, let—" His words were cut off in a strangled grunt of pain, and his hands flew up to his forehead. A solid smacking sound could be heard clearly around the square. Then Usal's hands dropped and revealed a mask of blood covering his eyes and upper face, flowing down to soak into his blue veil. He took one faltering step, missing the edge of the stall he was balanced on, and fell full length to the hard ground below. He lay there, unmoving. The Tuolagi stirred uneasily. Their leader had been cut down in mid-sentence. Yet there had been no evident weapon that had struck him. Only that ugly smacking sound, followed by a river of blood flowing down his face. The desert riders were superstitious. They believed that jinns and devils and spirits all lived in these ancient mountains. Now one of them, virtually out of thin air, seemed to have struck down their leader with terrifying force. They began to back away from the defensive line of the Aridi and Bedouin warriors, muttering to one another, asking what had happened to Usal. One of his lieutenants, braver than the rest, sprang up onto the stall in place of his leader and tried to rally them. "Tuolagi warriors," he yelled, his voice breaking. "Now is the time for—" Again there was a meaty smack, and, like Usal, the man's hands flew to grasp at a sudden, vicious wound that had appeared on his forehead. He lurched, grabbed for the stall's awning, missed, and fell to the ground. He knelt there, doubled over, clutching his face and moaning in pain. This time, Holt saw Evelyn at the rear of the platform, slowly lowering the sling. She caught his eye and gave him a grim smile. He noticed that the necklace of heavy marble stones was no longer round her throat. "Well, what do you know about that?" he asked of no one in particular. Demoralized, confused, and filled with superstitious fear, the Tuolagi began to back away. Then there was a chorus of battle cries and the clash of weapons as Umar and the rest of his force burst into the square. The Bedouin warriors fanned out quickly into a half circle, and the Tuolagi found themselves surrounded, with Umar and his men at their back and the 40 determined defenders before them. The Tuolagi were essentially bandits and thieves. They would fight without mercy, but only when the odds were solidly in their favor. A 4-to-1 advantage was the sort of ratio they looked for in a battle. When the numbers were virtually even, and with no leader to spur them on, their eagerness for battle tended to fade away. Slowly at first, then with increasing frequency, their weapons began to fall to the ground at their feet. "There's one last thing to take care of," Erak said. Umar's troops had disarmed the remaining Tuolagi and were busy subduing them, tying their hands behind their back and leaving them seated cross-legged in the square. Usal had been bound and taken under guard to the storeroom he had used as a prison. The Asik was still dazed and only semi-conscious. The heavy marble stone from Evelyn's sling had left him with a severe concussion. "Toshak?" Svengel answered him. Erak nodded. "Toshak. The treacherous swine has stolen off somewhere in all the confusion." "He was in front of the platform when the whole thing began," Holt pointed out. Evelyn nodded. "But he started to move towards those colonnades when Will began shooting," she said. She looked around. "Where is Will anyway? What's keeping him?" Will knelt in the rubble beneath the watchtower, his bow and quiver discarded, Alum's head resting on his knee. The Aridi lieutenant was dying. The loss of blood from his multiple wounds had been too great. As Will had dropped lightly from the wall to tend to him, he glanced up and saw the fat trader who had betrayed them, still standing, frozen to the spot, watching them. "Find a surgeon," he ordered, and as the man hesitated, he repeated the command. "Go! Get a surgeon! Do it quickly!" The fat man's eyes betrayed him. They slid away from Will's, and he turned to go. Will's cold voice stopped him. "Wait!" The man turned back. Still, he would not make eye contact with the ranger. "Look at me," Will commanded, and, slowly, the man raised his eyes. "If you run away, if you don't come back, be certain that I will hunt you down," Will told him. "I promise you won't enjoy that." He saw the fear of certain retribution slowly overcoming the treachery in the man's eyes, and the trader nodded quickly. Then he turned and slunk off into the alley behind him. Alum was muttering feverishly. Will unstrapped the small canteen from the Iridi's belt and trickled a few drops of water into the man's mouth. Alum's eyes cleared for a few moments, and he looked up at Will. "Did we win?" he asked. Will nodded. "We did," he assured him. He saw the relief in Alum's eyes. Then the lieutenant tried to struggle to a sitting position, and Will had to restrain him gently. "Rest," he said. "There's a surgeon coming." "The Wakir?" Alum said, then stopped and took several ragged breaths, as if the mere effort of speaking exhausted him. "Is he safe?" Again, Will nodded. "He's fine. I saw him with Holt when it was all over. Something happened to Usal," he added inconsequentially, still trying to understand what had gone on in the square. He had heard Usal's voice suddenly cut off in a cry of agony, yet he knew none of his friends had a bow with them. Alum had drifted into a state of delirium again, as if the news that his lord was safe was enough for him. His arms and legs began to twitch, and his breath was coming in ragged bursts. Will heard a soft patter of footsteps approaching in the alley, and he reached for the hilt of his sax knife. He had recovered it from the body of the dead Tuolagi when he first climbed down from the wall. Two figures emerged from the shadows of the valley, and he recognized the fat trader. Beside him was an older man, carrying a leather satchel over one arm. "This man is the healer," the trader said, and his companion came forward, dropping to his knees beside the muttering lieutenant. He looked around, saw Will's discarded cloak lying close by, and rolled it into a makeshift pillow. Then he placed it under Alum's head, allowing Will to move free. He examined the wounded man briefly, looked up at Will. "Your friend?" he asked. Will nodded. He'd only known Alum for a few days, but the man had held off 3 swordsmen to give Will the chance to save the others. You couldn't ask more of a friend than that. The surgeon shook his head. "I can give him something to ease the pain. Nothing more," he said. "He has lost too much blood." Will nodded sadly. "Do it," he said, and watched as the healer took a small vial from his satchel and allowed several drips of a clear liquid to fall into Alum's mouth, onto his tongue. In a few seconds, Alum began breathing more freely. His chest rose and fell more evenly. Then the breaths came more slowly, until finally they stopped. The surgeon looked up at Will. "He's gone," he said, and Will nodded sadly. He glanced up and saw the trader watching him fearfully. The man obviously was remembering how he had betrayed the 2 strangers to the Tuolagi. Now one of them was dead, and the other had shown that, young as he was not a man to cross. The trader wrung his hands together and moved forward, pleading for mercy. He dropped to his knees. "Lord, please, I didn't know you were," he began. Will cut him off with a contemptuous hand gesture. The man had betrayed them, he knew, but he had also returned with a surgeon. Suddenly, Will felt there had been enough killing on this day. "Oh, go away," he said quietly. "Just go away." The man's eyes widened. He couldn't believe his luck. He rose slowly and turned away. Then he hesitated, making sure Will hadn't changed his mind. Finally, reassured, he scuttled into the alley. Will heard his soft shoes pattering on the broken stones for a few minutes. Then there was silence. The surgeon regarded him with sympathy. He had laid Alum out with his hands folded over his chest. Will retrieved his cloak. Alum had no further use for it. He spread the lieutenant's own cloak over the still form, covering the face. Then he felt in his purse and handed the surgeon a silver coin. "Stay with him?" he asked, Watch over him until I come back." He reached down, retrieved his bow and quiver, and headed off down the alleyway to the market square.